Sometimes the deepest wounds come from the smallest voices. In a forgotten graveyard on the harsh 1800s frontier, a wealthy cattle baron encounters a grieving little girl who has just buried her mother and has nowhere left to turn in this unforgiving world. The hardened cowboy has spent years building his fortune, but losing his soul in the process. Now he faces an impossible choice: walk away from this helpless child, or take her under his protection and risk everything he's built. What begins as an act of reluctant mercy becomes a dangerous journey that will test both their spirits against the unforgiving dangers of the Old West. But can a man who has forgotten how to love learn to protect the one person who needs him most? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jeremiah Stone had built his empire one calculated decision at a time, each choice pulling him further from the boy who once believed in mercy. At 52, he commanded more land than any man in 3 counties, his cattle bearing the distinctive Broken Arrow brand that marked them as property of the most successful rancher in the Montana Territory. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of hard work and harder choices, now rested comfortably on the reins of power rather than simple leather. The gold pocket watch in his vest bore no sentimental inscription, only the precise German craftsmanship that measured time in profits and losses. He checked it now, standing beside his black stallion in the shadow of weathered headstones, calculating how much daylight remained for the ride back to his ranch. Time had become his most valuable commodity, more precious than the thousands of head of cattle that grazed across his vast holdings, more important than the loyalty of the 43 men who worked his land. The Broken Arrow Ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of prime Montana grassland, a testament to 30 years of shrewd business dealings and an iron will that had never bent to sentiment. Stone had started with nothing but borrowed money and borrowed time, working other men's cattle until he could afford his own. The first 100 head had cost him his relationship with his brother. The first 1,000 had cost him his marriage. The empire he ruled now had cost him his soul, though he told himself that was a fair trade for the security that came with owning everything the eye could see. His ranch house stood like a fortress against the horizon, built from timber and stone, quarried from his own land. Unlike the modest cabins and weathered farmhouses that dotted the territory, Stone's home declared its owner's success with every carefully crafted detail. Hand-carved banisters imported from Chicago, crystal chandeliers that caught the prairie sunlight, and enough rooms to house a family he'd never bothered to create. The irony wasn't lost on him that the largest house in the county echoed with the footsteps of only one man. The men who worked for him respected his fairness but feared his temper. Stone paid better wages than any other rancher in the territory, but he demanded absolute loyalty in return. His foreman, Marcus Webb, had ridden with him for 15 years. And understood that Stone's generosity came with conditions that were never spoken but always understood. Cross Jeremiah Stone, and you'd find yourself not just unemployed but unemployable anywhere within 200 miles. In the nearby town of Cedar Falls, Stone's influence extended like the shadow of a mountain. The bank president sought his counsel on major loans. The sheriff nodded respectfully when Stone rode through town. Even the preacher, though he disapproved of Stone's absence from Sunday services, accepted the generous donations that kept the church roof repaired and the poor fed. Stone had learned early that money could buy not just comfort, but also the silence of moral objections. Yet for all his success, there were debts that couldn't be paid with gold or cattle. The ghosts of his past followed him through the corridors of his grand house, whispering reminders of the choices that had brought him wealth at the cost of everything else. He'd stepped on friends to secure better grazing rights. He'd foreclosed on neighbors during hard winters, adding their land to his holdings while their children went hungry. Each acquisition had been legal, profitable, and morally bankrupt. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The boy who'd shared his last piece of bread with a hungry dog had gradually hardened into a man who saw kindness as weakness and mercy as a luxury he couldn't afford. Stone told himself that survival in the harsh frontier required such evolution, that only the strong could build something lasting in a land that killed the soft-hearted without remorse. His success story was well known throughout the territory, often told in saloons and around campfires as proof that any man could rise above his circumstances with enough determination. What the stories didn't mention were the bodies buried beneath. His fortune, not literal corpses, though there were a few of those too, but the dreams and hopes of others that he'd trampled on his way to the top. Stone's relationship with his workers reflected this complex legacy. Men like Carlos Mendez, his best horsebreaker, respected Stone's ability to read character and pay fairly, but they also knew to keep their distance. Sarah Murphy, the Irish widow who served as his housekeeper, appreciated the steady work and generous wages, but she crossed herself whenever Stone's temper flared. Even Marcus Webb, loyal as a hound, sometimes looked at his boss with something approaching pity rather than admiration. The gold watch ticked steadily against Stone's chest, marking time that he'd spent accumulating wealth while avoiding the deeper questions of purpose and legacy. What good was an empire with no heir? What meaning could be found in success that left a man completely alone? These thoughts troubled him more as the years passed, but he pushed them aside with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to business problems. Standing now in this forgotten graveyard, surrounded by markers of lives that had ended with little to show for their struggles, Stone felt the weight of his own mortality pressing down like storm clouds. The elaborate headstones of the wealthy stood beside simple wooden crosses marking the graves of the poor, and death had made equals of them all. His gold pocket watch would someday tick for another man, his cattle would bear another brand, and his empire would pass to strangers who had never known the cost of building it. The irony struck him with unexpected force. He, who had spent decades accumulating possessions, now faced the stark reality that none of them could accompany him into whatever lay beyond. The watch that had measured his profitable hours would someday measure his final moments, and all his careful calculations would prove meaningless against the simple arithmetic of mortality. But these philosophical musings were interrupted by a sound that cut through his contemplation like a knife through silk. A child's voice, small and lost, speaking words that would haunt him for the rest of his days. "My mama went to heaven today. I got nobody left." Stone turned toward the voice, his practical mind already calculating the complications this encounter might bring, while something deeper, something he'd buried beneath years of cold pragmatism, stirred uncomfortably in his chest. The girl who stood beside a fresh grave was small and dark-skinned, her simple dress torn and stained with the evidence of her long vigil. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but her eyes held the exhausted wisdom of someone who had learned too early that the world offered no guarantees of kindness. In that moment, as his gold pocket watch ticked away the seconds of decision, Jeremiah Stone faced a choice that would define not just his immediate future, but the very meaning of everything he'd built. The practical man in him calculated the risks of involvement, while something else, something he'd thought long dead, whispered that some things mattered more than profit and loss. The girl clutched a worn ragdoll against her chest, its faded blue dress and missing button eye testament to years of faithful companionship. Stone had seen enough poverty in his lifetime to recognize the signs, the careful way she held her. Only possession, the hollow look of someone who had already lost everything that mattered. The doll's stuffing showed through a tear in its side, and one arm hung by a few stubborn threads, but the child's grip suggested it might be the most precious thing in the world. "Child," Stone said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Where's your people?" She looked up at him with eyes that seemed too old for her small face. "Ain't got no people, mister. Mama was all I had, and the Lord took her home yesterday." Her voice carried the careful politeness of someone who had learned that survival depended on not giving offense, even in grief. Stone glanced at the fresh grave, noting the simple wooden cross that marked it. No headstone, no elaborate marker, just rough pine boards, nailed together by someone who couldn't afford better. "What about your father? Grandparents? Anyone?" The girl shook her head, still clutching the rag doll. "Daddy died before I was born. Mama said he was a good man, but the fever took him. And Mama's folks," she paused, looking down at the grave. "They didn't want us, said we was cursed on account of my skin." The words hit Stone like a physical blow. He'd seen prejudice in action countless times, had even benefited from it when it served his business interests. But hearing it described so matter-of-factly by a child made his stomach turn. "Where you been staying?" "Mrs. Henderson let me sleep in her barn for a few nights, but she said I can't stay no more. Said folks is talking and it ain't proper." The girl's voice remained steady, but Stone caught the tremor of fear beneath her composed exterior. "I've been praying the Lord would send someone to help, but maybe he's too busy." Stone felt something crack inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades. This child, who had every reason to be bitter, still spoke of prayer and hope, with the innocent faith of someone who believed the world might yet show mercy. The rag doll in her arms seemed to stare at him with its one remaining button eye, a silent witness to his moment of decision. "What's your name, girl?" "Ruby, sir. Ruby Mae Johnson. Mama named me after her grandmother's ring, the one she had to sell when times got hard." She looked up at him with a mixture of hope and wariness. "You seem like a nice man. You got any children?" The question struck him unexpectedly. "No, no children." "That's sad," Ruby said with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Mama always said children was the greatest blessing, even when we didn't have much else." Stone studied the girl more carefully, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the way she carried herself despite her circumstances. Her dress had been mended multiple times with different colored thread, creating a patchwork that spoke of careful and thrift rather than carelessness. Someone had taught her manners and proper speech, though grief and exhaustion had worn down her careful pronunciations. "Ruby," he said slowly, testing the name. "How old are you?" 8 years old, sir. "Almost 9 come Christmas." She shifted the rag doll to one arm and wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "Mama was teaching me to read before she got sick. I can do my letters and some small words." The practical part of Stone's mind began calculating the implications of what he was considering. Taking in this child would create complications he couldn't fully anticipate. The town's reaction would be swift and harsh. A wealthy white man caring for a black child would scandalize the more conservative residents and potentially damage his business relationships. Some of his own workers might object, despite his authority over them. But the alternative was leaving an 8-year-old girl to face the world alone. Stone had done many cruel things in his pursuit of success, but even his hardened heart couldn't contemplate abandoning a child to certain death. The frontier was unforgiving to grown men with resources and connections. What chance did Ruby have on her own? "You got anywhere else to go?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Ruby shook her head, her lower lip trembling slightly. "No, sir. I've been thinking maybe I could walk to the next town, see if someone there might need help with chores or something. I'm a good worker, and I don't eat much." The image of this small girl walking alone across miles of dangerous territory made Stone's decision for him. He'd seen what happened to lone travelers, especially children, in this harsh land. Wolves, both animal and human, would make short work of someone so vulnerable. "Listen to me, Ruby Mae Johnson," Stone said, kneeling down to her level. "I got a ranch about 5 miles from here. Big house, lots of land. You come with me for now, and we'll figure out what comes next." Ruby's eyes widened with surprise, and something that might have been hope. "You mean it, mister? You'd really take me in?" "Name's Jeremiah Stone," he said, extending his hand. "And yes, I mean it. Can't promise." It'll be easy and can't promise folks will like it, but you'll have a roof over your head and food in your belly." Ruby reached out tentatively and shook his hand, with the formal gravity of someone sealing an important agreement. Her small fingers were cold and rough from hard work, and Stone felt another unfamiliar pang in his chest. "Thank you, Mr. Stone. I'll work hard, I promise. I won't be any trouble." "We'll see about that," Stone said, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. He looked down at the fresh grave, noting the care with which someone had arranged wild flowers around the base of the cross. "You want to say goodbye proper?" Ruby nodded and walked back to her mother's grave, kneeling beside it with the rag doll pressed against her heart. Stone watched as she whispered words he couldn't hear, her small shoulders shaking with the effort of containing her grief. When she finally stood and turned back to him, her face was set with the determined expression of someone who had decided to be brave. "I'm ready, Mr. Stone." Stone lifted Ruby onto his horse, noting how light she was, too light for a child her age. He settled behind her, making sure she was secure before urging the stallion forward. As they rode away from the graveyard, Ruby turned for one last look at her mother's grave. The rag doll still clutched in her arms like a talisman against an uncertain future. The ride to the ranch would give Stone time to consider what he'd just committed himself to. But for now, he focused on the weight of the child in front of him, and the strange sensation that for the first time in decades, he might be doing something truly worthwhile. The gold pocket watch in his vest continued its steady ticking, but somehow the sound seemed less urgent, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate this moment of unexpected grace. The Broken Arrow Ranch emerged from the prairie like a small city built from timber and stone, its buildings arranged with the methodical precision that characterized everything Jeremiah Stone touched. Ruby's sharp intake of breath when the main house came into view told Stone she'd never seen anything so grand. The two-story structure rose against the Montana sky with an authority that spoke of permanence and prosperity, its wraparound porch and carefully maintained grounds, declaring their owner's success to anyone with eyes to see. Marcus Webb was the first to notice them approaching, his weathered face creasing with concern as he recognized the small passenger riding in front of his boss. The foreman had worked for Stone long enough to read his moods and motivations, but this development fell outside any pattern he could recognize. He walked toward them with the careful gait of a man who'd spent 40 years in the saddle, his expression neutral, but his eyes alert. "Boss," Marcus said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. His gaze moved to Ruby, taking in her torn dress and the rag doll she held protectively against her chest. "Everything all right?" Stone dismounted and helped Ruby down, noting how she stayed close to his side, despite her natural curiosity about the bustling ranch. "Marcus, this is Ruby Mae Johnson. She'll be staying with us for a while." The foreman's eyebrows rose slightly, but years of working for Stone had taught him when to ask questions and when to simply accept orders. "Yes, sir. I'll have Carlos set up one of the guest rooms." "The blue room," Stone said, remembering the smallest and most comfortable of the spare bedrooms. "And ask Sarah to find some proper clothes. The child needs—" He paused, realizing he had no idea what a little girl might need beyond the basics of food and shelter. Sarah Murphy appeared on the porch as if summoned by the mention of her name. Her red hair caught back in a practical bun and her work dress covered by a flour-dusted apron. The Irish housekeeper had managed Stone's domestic affairs for 7 years with efficient competence, but she stopped short when she saw Ruby standing beside her employer. "Mother of God," Sarah whispered, crossing herself instinctively. Her eyes moved from Ruby to Stone and back again, clearly struggling to process this unexpected development. "Sir, you didn't know myself until an hour ago," Stone interrupted. "Ruby's mother passed yesterday. She's got nowhere else to go." Sarah's expression softened immediately, her maternal instincts overriding her surprise. She came down the porch steps with her arms outstretched, speaking in the gentle tone she reserved for injured animals and frightened children. "Oh, you poor darling. Come here to Sarah, sweetheart." Ruby looked to Stone for permission before stepping toward the housekeeper. Sarah knelt and gathered the girl into a warm embrace, her practiced hands quickly assessing Ruby's condition. "Skin and bones, this one. When did you last have a proper meal, love?" "Day before yesterday," Ruby admitted quietly. "Mrs. Henderson gave me some bread and butter, but she said—" "Never mind what she said," Sarah interrupted with characteristic firmness. "We'll get some food in you right away, and then we'll see about a proper bath and clean clothes." She looked up at Stone with a mixture of approval and concern. "The child's half-starved, sir." Stone felt heat rise in his cheeks, though he couldn't explain why the housekeeper's gentle reproof affected him so strongly. "Take care of whatever she needs," he said brusquely. "I'll be in my office." But as he started toward the house, Ruby's small voice stopped him. "Mr. Stone, do you think there might be a Bible somewhere? Mama always read to me from the good book before bed." Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances, both aware that their employer's relationship with religion had been complicated at best since his wife's death years earlier. Stone kept a leather-bound Bible in his study, a wedding gift from his mother that had gathered dust for the better part of a decade, but he'd never spoken of it to anyone. "I believe there's one around somewhere," Stone said carefully. "Sarah will help you find it." The housekeeper nodded, understanding more than Stone's words conveyed. "Of course, dear. Now come along. Let's get you settled and fed properly." As Sarah led Ruby toward the house, chattering about hot soup and clean clothes, Stone caught Marcus watching him with an unreadable expression. The foreman had been with him through enough challenges to read the signs of his boss wrestling with a difficult decision. "Something you want to say, Marcus?" Stone asked. "Just wondering what you're planning, boss. Town folks aren't going to take kindly to this arrangement, especially given—" Marcus gestured toward Ruby's retreating figure. "Given what?" Stone's voice carried a warning edge. "You know what I mean. Rich white man taking in a colored child. Folks will talk, and not all of it will be friendly." Marcus spoke with the careful honesty of someone who'd earned the right to offer unwelcome truths. "Some of the boys might have opinions too." Stone felt his jaw tighten. "Any of the boys who have opinions about who I choose to help can collect their pay and ride out. Same goes for the town folks. I didn't build this place to win popularity contests." "Understood, sir. Just thought you should know what you're walking into." Marcus adjusted his hat and prepared to walk away, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think it's a decent thing you're doing. Girl deserves a chance." Inside the house, Sarah was already bustling around the kitchen, heating water for a bath and preparing a plate of cold meat and fresh bread. Ruby sat at the large wooden table, her rag doll placed carefully beside her plate, taking small, careful bites as if afraid the food might disappear if she ate too quickly. "Take your time, love," Sarah said gently. "There's plenty more where that came from." Ruby nodded, swallowing before speaking. "Mrs. Murphy, do you think Mr. Stone really means to let me stay? Some folks say things they don't mean when they're feeling sorry for someone." Sarah paused in her preparations, struck by the child's perceptive question. "Mr. Stone isn't the type to say things he doesn't mean, dear. If he brought you here, he intends for you to stay. At least for now." "I don't want to be trouble for anyone," Ruby said quietly. "I can work. I'm good at cleaning and mending, and Mama taught me to cook some. The only trouble you'll be is if you don't eat every bite of that food," Sarah replied firmly. "Mr. Stone can afford to feed an army, so don't you worry about being a burden." As evening settled over the ranch, Stone found himself standing in his study, holding the leather-bound Bible his mother had given him on his wedding day. The gilt lettering on the cover had faded, and the pages smelled of dust and neglect. He couldn't remember the last time he'd opened it, but Ruby's simple request had stirred memories of his own childhood, when faith had seemed as natural as breathing. The sound of Sarah's gentle voice drifting down from upstairs told him the housekeeper was reading to Ruby, probably from one of the children's books that had belonged to his late wife. Stone opened the Bible randomly and found himself reading, words that seemed to speak directly to his current situation. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress. He closed the book with a sharp snap, unsettled by the coincidence, but found himself climbing the stairs to check on his unexpected houseguest before retiring for the night. 3 weeks into Ruby's stay at the Broken Arrow, Stone stood in his workshop examining the cattle branding iron that bore his distinctive mark, an arrow broken at its center, symbolizing his philosophy that sometimes things had to be broken before they could be remade stronger. The iron's handle was smooth from years of use, and the metal still bore traces of yesterday's work, marking his newest carves. Each brand declared ownership and protection. His cattle were his responsibility, and he defended what was his with unwavering determination. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was considering a similar sense of ownership regarding Ruby, though the child couldn't be marked and claimed with hot iron. She'd been staying in the blue guest room for 3 weeks now, and despite his best efforts to find her a more suitable home, every door in Cedar Falls had been firmly closed to them. The Weatherbys, who ran the dry goods store and attended church every Sunday, had listened politely to Stone's proposal before explaining that they simply couldn't take in someone like that. The banker's wife had been more direct, stating that, while she sympathized with the child's plight, it wouldn't be appropriate for a respectable family to harbor a Negro girl. Even the preacher, despite his sermons about Christian charity, had suggested that Ruby might be happier with her own kind in one of the colored settlements further east. Each rejection had stung more than Stone expected. He'd built his reputation on being able to negotiate anything, to find solutions where others saw only problems. But when it came to finding Ruby a home, his influence meant nothing. Money couldn't buy acceptance for a little girl whose only crime was the color of her skin. "Boss," Marcus Webb's voice interrupted his brooding. The foreman stood in the workshop doorway, his expression troubled. "We got a problem," Stone said, down the branding iron, and turned his full attention to his most trusted employee. "What kind of problem?" "Davies and his crew pulled out this morning, said they couldn't work for a man who'd bring shame on the whole territory." Marcus paused, clearly uncomfortable with delivering bad news. "That's 6 good hands gone, and word's getting around town. Some of the other ranchers are talking about not doing business with us." The news hit Stone like a physical blow, though he kept his expression neutral. Tom Davies had been one of his most reliable workers, a steady man with a family to feed. If Davies was willing to give up good wages over Ruby's presence, the situation was worse than Stone had imagined. "Any of the other boys saying anything?" "Most are keeping their opinions to themselves, but there's been talk. Some think you've lost your mind, taking in a colored child. Others figure it's your business and they're not paid to have opinions." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I hate to say it, boss, but this could hurt us come roundup time. Good hands are hard to find, and if word spreads—" "Let it spread," Stone interrupted, surprised by the steel in his own voice. "Any man who'd abandon honest work because he doesn't like who I choose to help isn't someone I want working my cattle anyway." Marcus nodded slowly, though his expression remained concerned. "What about the business side of things? Miller's already talking about finding another supplier for his Chicago contracts." Stone felt his jaw clench. Harold Miller's contracts represented nearly a quarter of his annual income, and losing them would force him to make some uncomfortable adjustments. But the thought of sending Ruby away to appease small-minded prejudices made his stomach turn. "Miller can take his business wherever he wants," Stone said finally. "We'll find other buyers." That evening at dinner, Ruby seemed to sense the tension, despite Stone's efforts to maintain normalcy. She ate quietly, occasionally glancing between Stone and Sarah, with the perceptive awareness of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for survival. When Sarah served dessert, apple pie made from the last of the winter stores, Ruby spoke up hesitantly. "Mr. Stone, are folks angry because you're helping me?" Stone paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, caught off guard by her directness. Sarah shot him a warning look over Ruby's head, clearly hoping he'd find a way to reassure the child without lying. "Some folks have strong opinions about things," Stone said carefully. "That doesn't mean those opinions are right." Ruby nodded solemnly, as if she'd expected this answer. "Mama used to say that people fear what they don't understand, and sometimes that fear makes them mean." She took a small bite of pie before continuing. "I don't want to cause you trouble, Mr. Stone. Maybe I should—" "You're not going anywhere," Stone interrupted, the firmness in his voice surprising everyone at the table, including himself. "This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be." Ruby's eyes widened with something that looked like hope mixed with disbelief. "You really mean that? Even if people stay angry?" Stone looked at this brave little girl who'd faced more hardship in 8 years than most adults saw in a lifetime, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The branding iron in his workshop marked cattle as his property, his responsibility to protect and care for. Ruby couldn't be branded, but she could be claimed in other ways, through loyalty, through commitment, through the simple act of choosing to stand by her despite the cost. "I mean it," he said, reaching across the table to squeeze her small hand. "You're family now, Ruby Mae Johnson. Family sticks together no matter what." Tears filled Ruby's eyes as she squeezed his hand in return. "Thank you, Mr. Stone. I promise I'll make you proud." Later that night, Stone stood on his porch looking out over his vast holdings. The land stretched endlessly under the star-filled sky, marked by fence posts and branded cattle that declared his ownership of everything the eye could see. He'd built this empire through calculation and careful planning, always weighing costs against benefits, always choosing the path that led to greater profit. But Ruby had changed that equation. For the first time in decades, Stone found himself making decisions based on something other than financial gain. The girl, sleeping peacefully in the blue room upstairs, was worth more than Miller's contracts or Davis's approval. She was worth more than the social acceptance he'd never really cared about anyway. Sarah appeared beside him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. "You're doing a good thing, sir," she said quietly. The child needed someone to stand up for her. "I'm not doing it to be good," Stone replied, though even as he said it, he wondered if that was entirely true. "She's got nowhere else to go." "Perhaps," Sarah said, with the gentle wisdom of someone who'd watched him struggle with his decision. "But you could have found somewhere else for her to go if you'd really wanted to. The fact that you didn't tells me everything I need to know about the man you really are." As Stone watched his cattle settling for the night, each one bearing his protective brand, he realized that Ruby had somehow branded him in return, marked him as surely as hot iron marked, claiming him as her protector and guardian. It was a responsibility he'd never sought, but found himself strangely grateful to bear. The wanted poster had been nailed to the post office wall for exactly 3 hours before someone tore it down and brought it to Stone's attention. Marcus Webb held the yellowed paper carefully, as if it might burst into flames, his weathered face grave with concern. The crude sketch bore enough resemblance to a younger Jeremiah Stone to be unmistakable, and the name beneath it, Jake Morrison, made Stone's blood run cold. "Where did this come from?" Stone asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Showed up on the morning stage from Denver," Marcus replied quietly. "Sheriff Daniels says there's been 3 or 4 of them posted around town. Someone's definitely looking for you, boss, or for who you used to be." Stone studied the poster more carefully, noting the reward amount, $500 dead or alive, and the charges listed beneath his old alias. Cattle rustling, armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon. The crimes were accurate enough, though they barely scratched the surface of what Jake Morrison had done during his 5-year reign of terror across Colorado and Wyoming territories. Ruby chose that moment to come running around the corner of the house, her face bright with excitement as she chased one of the barn cats. She pulled up short when she saw the serious expressions on the men's faces, her smile fading as she took in the tension. "Is everything all right, Mr. Stone?" she asked, her voice carrying the wariness of someone who'd learned to recognize danger. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Stone said, quickly folding the poster and tucking it into his jacket. "Why don't you go help Sarah with the washing? I'll be along directly." Ruby nodded but didn't move immediately, her perceptive eyes studying both men with the uncomfortable insight of a child who'd been forced to grow up too quickly. "Someone's trying to hurt you, aren't they?" The question caught Stone off guard. He'd forgotten how observant children could be, how they picked up on adult fears and tensions even when adults thought they were being discreet. "What makes you say that? You got the same look Mama used to get when the rent man came around," Ruby said simply, "like you're expecting bad news and getting ready to fight." Stone knelt down to Ruby's level, struck once again by her maturity and perception. "I won't lie to you, Ruby. There might be some trouble coming, but I want you to know that no matter what happens, you're safe here. You understand me?" Ruby nodded solemnly, then surprised him by wrapping her small arms around his neck in a fierce hug. "I ain't afraid, Mr. Stone. You're the strongest man I know, and you got God on your side now." The simple faith in her voice made Stone's throat tight with emotion. After she ran off to find Sarah, he turned back to Marcus with an expression that would have terrified anyone who didn't know him as well as his foreman did. "How much do you know about Jake Morrison?" Stone asked. "Enough," Marcus replied carefully. "I figured when you hired me that everyone's got a past worth leaving behind. Didn't seem like my business to ask questions. Well, now it might become your business, whether you want it to or not." Stone looked toward the horizon, calculating distances and possibilities. "Those posters didn't show up by accident. Someone's tracked Jake Morrison to Jeremiah Stone, which means they know where to find me. Bounty hunters? Worse. Jake Morrison made a lot of enemies during his career, and some of them hold grudges." Stone's expression darkened as memories surfaced. Faces of men he'd wronged, families he'd destroyed, lives he'd ruined in his pursuit of easy money and excitement. "There's a man named Silas Kane who's been hunting me for 8 years. He blamed Morrison for his son's death, and he swore he'd see me hang for it." Marcus absorbed this information with the calm acceptance of someone who'd lived through enough violence to understand its inevitability. "What do you want to do?" "First, we make sure Ruby stays safe. If trouble comes calling, I don't want her anywhere near it." Stone's voice carried the steel of absolute determination. "Second, we prepare for a fight. Kane doesn't strike me as the type to involve the law when he can handle things personally." That preparation began immediately. Stone sent 2 of his most trusted hands to town with instructions to watch for strangers and report back immediately. He moved Ruby's belongings to a room on the 2nd floor with a clear view of the approaches to the house, and made sure Sarah understood that at the first sign of trouble, she was to take the girl to the root cellar and stay there until given the all clear. The waiting lasted 4 days. Stone was working with a difficult horse in the breaking corral when Marcus appeared at his elbow, his face tight with tension. "Company coming, boss." 3 riders, moving slow and deliberate. "They're not trying to hide their approach." Stone handed the horse's reins to one of the younger hands and walked to the edge of the corral where he could see the approaching riders. Even at a distance, he recognized the lead figure's distinctive silhouette, tall and lean, sitting his horse with the rigid posture of a man carrying the weight of obsession. Silas Kane had found him at last. Ruby was playing in the yard between the house and the barn, her rag doll propped against a fence post while she practiced the letters Sarah had been teaching her. The sight of her small figure, innocent and vulnerable, made Stone's blood run cold. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, he couldn't let her witness the violence that was surely coming. "Ruby," he called, keeping his voice level despite the urgency he felt. "Go inside and stay with Sarah. Right now." Something in his tone must have warned her, because she gathered up her doll and ran toward the house without argument. Stone watched her disappear through the kitchen door before turning his attention back to the approaching riders. Silas Kane drew his horse to a stop 20 yards from the corral, his pale eyes fixed on Stone with the intensity of a man who'd waited 8 years for this moment. He was older than Stone remembered, his hair gone grey, and his face lined with the deep grooves of chronic anger, but his hands remained steady on his rifle. "Jake Morrison," Kane said, his voice carrying across the distance like a judge pronouncing sentence. "Been a long time. My name is Jeremiah Stone," Stone replied evenly. "You're not welcome on my land." Kane's laugh held no humor. "You can call yourself whatever you want, but I know who you are. I've been tracking you for 8 years, ever since you murdered my boy." Stone felt the familiar tightness in his chest that preceded violence, the heightened awareness that had kept Jake Morrison alive through countless gunfights. "Your boy chose to draw on me, Kane. I gave him every chance to walk away. He was 17 years old." Kane's voice cracked with the pain of old grief. "Just a kid trying to prove himself, and you gunned him down like a rabid dog." The accusation hung in the air between them like gun smoke, and Stone knew that no amount of explanation would change what was about to happen. Kane had come here for blood, not conversation, and the 2 men flanking him looked like they'd be happy to provide whatever violence their boss required. Stone could feel eyes watching from the house, Sarah and Ruby, no doubt peering through the kitchen window. Despite his instructions to stay hidden, the knowledge that Ruby might witness what came next made his stomach turn, but Kane's presence left him no choice. Some debts could only be paid in blood, and Jake Morrison's past had finally caught up with Jeremiah Stone's present. The silver locket lay forgotten in the bottom drawer of Stone's desk, buried beneath years of legal documents and business correspondence. He hadn't looked at it in over a decade, but Ruby's presence in his house had stirred memories he'd thought permanently buried. The locket bore the inscription, "Forever yours, Margaret," in delicate script, a reminder of the woman who died giving birth to the son Stone never got to hold. That night, after the confrontation with Kane had ended in an uneasy standoff, the bounty hunter promising to return with the law and Stone warning him to stay off his property, Stone found himself alone in his study, holding the locket and remembering. The man he'd been before Jake Morrison consumed his soul. Margaret Stone had been the daughter of a prosperous farmer, a gentle woman who'd seen something worth saving in the angry young drifter who'd hired on to work her father's land. She'd married him despite her family's objections, believing that love could tame the wildness in his heart. For 3 years, she'd been right. Stone had worked hard, saved money, and dreamed of building something permanent with the woman who'd taught him that life could hold more than violence and running. But childbirth had taken her, and the fever had claimed their son 3 days later. Stone had stood beside 2 small graves, holding a silver locket that would never again rest against the heart of the woman he'd loved, and felt something fundamental break inside him. Within a month, he'd sold the farm, taken the name Jake Morrison, and disappeared into the lawless territories where a man with fast hands and a broken heart could make a living with his gun. "Mr. Stone." Ruby's voice from the doorway interrupted his brooding. She stood there in her nightgown, clutching her rag doll, her dark eyes wide with concern. "I heard glass breaking. Are you hurt?" Stone looked down and realized he'd crushed the whiskey tumbler in his hand, sending amber liquid and broken glass across his desk. Blood welled from a small cut on his palm, but he barely felt the sting. "Just clumsy," he said, reaching for his handkerchief to wrap the cut. "You should be in bed, sweetheart." Ruby approached cautiously, studying his face with the perceptive awareness that had become familiar. "You're thinking about sad things again. You get that same look Mama used to get when she remembered my daddy." The child's insight never ceased to amaze him. Stone set down the locket and gestured for Ruby to come closer. "Sometimes grown-ups have memories that hurt, even when they happened a long time ago. Mama said memories are like scars. They hurt when you touch them, but they're proof you survived something hard." Ruby climbed onto the chair beside his desk, her small legs swinging freely. "What's that pretty thing?" Stone hesitated, then opened the locket to reveal the tiny photograph inside, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, dressed in her wedding finery. This was my wife, Margaret. She died a long time ago. Ruby studied the photograph with solemn attention. She looks nice, like the kind of lady who'd bake cookies and tell bedtime stories. She was, Stone said softly. She was everything good in this world, and I lost her because... He stopped, unable to voice the guilt that had driven him into the wilderness all those years ago. Because sometimes bad things happen to good people, Ruby finished quietly. That's what Mama used to say when I asked why Daddy had to die before I was born. Stone felt tears threaten for the first time in years. This child, who'd lost everything herself, was trying to comfort him in his grief. Ruby, I need you to understand something. The man who came here today, Cain, he's looking for someone I used to be. Someone who did terrible things. Ruby nodded, as if she'd been expecting this conversation. Are you still that person? The question cut to the heart of everything Stone had been wrestling with since bringing Ruby home. Was he still Jake Morrison, the man who'd killed Cain's son in a moment of drunken rage? Was he still the outlaw who'd robbed and stolen his way across 2 territories? Or had Ruby's presence somehow awakened the man he'd been before grief and anger consumed him? I don't know, he said honestly. I hope not. But if that man comes back with more guns, I might have to become him again to protect you. Ruby slipped down from the chair and walked around to his side of the desk, wrapping her small arms around his neck in a fierce hug. You're not the same person, Mr. Stone. Bad people don't take in little girls who got nobody. Bad people don't read Bible stories or make sure there's always enough food on the table. Stone held her close, breathing in the clean scent of Sarah's soap in her hair and feeling something settle in his chest. How did you get so wise, little one? Mama always said that when God closes one door, he opens another one somewhere else. Maybe losing your wife was God closing a door, and finding me was him opening a new one. Ruby pulled back to look at him seriously. Maybe we're supposed to take care of each other. That night, after tucking Ruby into bed and reading her a chapter from the children's Bible Sarah had found in town, Stone stood at his bedroom window, looking out over his land. Somewhere in the darkness, Cain was probably making plans, gathering men and weapons for another confrontation. The law might be on Cain's side. Jake Morrison was still a wanted man, regardless of how many years had passed, or how completely Jeremiah Stone had buried that identity. But for the first time since Margaret's death, Stone felt he had something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. Ruby's faith in his transformation gave him hope that maybe, just maybe, a man could leave his past behind and build something better from the ashes of his mistakes. The silver locket sat open on his nightstand, Margaret's photograph catching the moonlight that streamed through his window. She'd believed in redemption too, had seen past Jake Morrison's angry facade to the decent man underneath. Now Ruby was offering him that same gift, the chance to be worthy of the faith others placed in him. Marcus appeared at his door, his expression grim. Boss, we got riders circling the property. Cain's brought friends, and they're not planning a social visit. Stone closed the locket with a soft click and slipped it into his pocket, next to his heart, where Margaret's memory could give him strength for what was coming. How many? 8, maybe 10. They're staying out of rifle range, but they're definitely watching the house. Marcus paused. I sent Carlos to town for the sheriff, but Cain might have that angle covered too. Probably does, Stone agreed. A man doesn't hunt someone for 8 years without learning how to work the system. He checked his pistol and reached for his rifle, the familiar weight of weapons bringing back muscle memories from his days as Jake Morrison. Make sure Ruby and Sarah are in the cellar, then get the boys ready. If Cain wants a fight, we'll give him one he won't forget. As he prepared for battle, Stone touched the locket in his pocket one more time, drawing strength from the memory of love and the promise of redemption that now slept peacefully in the blue room upstairs. The yellowed letter fell from between the pages of Ruby's mother's Bible like a ghost emerging from the past. Ruby had been looking for comfort in the familiar words her mother used to read to her when she noticed the paper's edge protruding from the Book of Psalms. The envelope bore her mother's careful handwriting. For Ruby, when she's old enough to understand. Stone found her sitting on her bed 20 minutes later, the opened letter clutched in her trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. The Bible lay forgotten beside her, and her rag doll had fallen to the floor, something that would never have happened under normal circumstances. "Ruby!" Stone's voice carried immediate concern as he stepped into the room. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" She looked up at him with eyes full of hurt and confusion, holding out the letter with a shaking hand. "Mama knew," she whispered. "She knew who you were all along." Stone felt the blood drain from his face as he recognized his wife's delicate handwriting on the aged paper. The letter he'd written to Margaret years ago, describing the terrible fight that had ended with a young man's death in a Denver saloon. He'd thought all evidence of that night had been destroyed, but somehow Ruby's mother had possessed this piece of his darkest history. With growing horror, Stone read the letter's contents, each word hitting him like a physical blow. "My dearest Margaret, I can't live with this secret any longer. Last night in Denver, I killed a man. A young man who couldn't have been more than 19. His name was Samuel Johnson, and he was defending his wife's honor when I was too drunk to care about right or wrong. I shot him down like a mad dog, and his pregnant wife screamed over his body while I rode away into the night. I am no longer the man you married. I am something broken and evil, and I'm running before the law can catch up with me. If you ever have occasion to meet Samuel Johnson's widow and child, please tell them I'm sorry. Tell them Jake Morrison died with shame in his heart. Forever yours, Jake." "Samuel Johnson was my daddy," Ruby said in a voice barely above a whisper. "And you're Jake Morrison. You killed my daddy and left my mama to raise me alone." Stone dropped to his knees beside her bed, the weight of this revelation crushing him like a physical blow. All these weeks of growing to love this brave little girl, all his plans to protect her and give her a better life, and she was the daughter of the man whose death had haunted his nightmares for 8 years. "Ruby, he began, but she cut him off with a look of such profound betrayal that it stole his breath. "Mama knew," Ruby repeated, her voice stronger now but filled with a pain that cut Stone to his core. "She knew who you were when you found me at the graveyard. That's why she never remarried, why she never talked bad about my daddy's killer. She was waiting for God to bring you back to make things right." Stone reached out instinctively, wanting to comfort her, but Ruby recoiled from his touch as if he'd struck her. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't touch me. You killed my daddy. You made me an orphan before I was even born. Ruby, please let me explain." "Explain what?" Her voice rose to a shout that brought Sarah running from downstairs. "Explain how? You shot down my daddy in cold blood. Explain how you left my mama to struggle and starve while you built yourself a fancy ranch with stolen money." Stone felt his world collapsing around him. Every moment of joy he'd experienced since bringing Ruby home now tasted like ashes in his mouth. The child he'd grown to love, the daughter he'd never had, was the living consequence of his worst sin, a daily reminder of the life he'd destroyed in a moment of drunken rage. "I was a different man then," Stone said desperately. "I was broken and angry, and my daddy was just trying to protect my mama from men like you," Ruby interrupted, her young voice carrying a wisdom and judgment that made Stone feel smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. "Mrs. Henderson told me the story once about how some drunk cowboy shot a young man in Denver for standing up to him. She didn't know the drunk cowboy was you, and she didn't know the young man was my daddy." Sarah appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with immediate understanding. The letter in Ruby's hands, the devastation on Stone's face, the tears streaming down the child's cheeks, the pieces fell together with horrible clarity. "Oh, dear Lord," Sarah whispered, crossing herself. "Sir, is it true?" Stone couldn't find his voice to answer, but his expression was confession enough. the housekeeper's face filled with a mixture of pity and horror as she realized the magnitude of the tragedy unfolding before her. "Get away from me," Ruby said, clutching the letter to her chest. "Get away from me and don't come back. I don't want your fancy house or your guilt money. I'd rather starve than take charity from the man who murdered my daddy." The sound of breaking glass from downstairs interrupted the confrontation, followed by Marcus Webb's urgent shout, "Boss, they're coming! Kane's brought an army!" Stone stood on unsteady legs, torn between the immediate physical danger and the emotional devastation of Ruby's discovery. Through the window, he could see torches moving in the darkness. Kane and his men were surrounding the house, using the cover of night to close their trap. "Ruby, we have to get you to safety," Stone said, forcing himself to focus on the immediate threat. "Whatever you think of me, I won't let them hurt you." "Why should I trust you?" Ruby shot back, but her voice carried a note of fear as the sounds of men and horses grew closer. "How do I know you won't just shoot me like you shot my daddy?" This accusation hit Stone like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Because I'd die before I let any harm come to you. That much is true, regardless of what else I've done." Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs, his rifle in, his hands and his face grim. "Boss, they've got us surrounded. Kane's demanding you come out alone, or they'll burn the house down with everyone inside." Stone felt the trap closing around him. Kane had chosen his moment perfectly, using Stone's emotional vulnerability to force a confrontation when his defenses were down. The bounty hunter couldn't have known about the letter's contents, but he'd clearly sensed an opportunity and seized it. "Take Ruby and Sarah to the cellar," Stone ordered, reaching for his gun belt. "Bar the door and don't come out until morning, no matter what you hear." "I'm not hiding in a cellar while you die for my sins," Ruby said suddenly, her anger giving way to something else, a stubborn courage that reminded Stone painfully of her father's final stand in that Denver saloon. If Kane wants to kill Jake Morrison, then let him face the man Jake Morrison became. "Ruby, no!" "Yes," she said firmly, standing up and wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Mama always said that when you do wrong, you got to face the consequences. But she also said that God's mercy is bigger than any sin, and that redemption comes through sacrifice." She looked directly at Stone, with eyes that seemed far too old for her 8 years. "Maybe this is how you pay for what you did to my daddy. Maybe this is how you finally make things right." Outside, Kane's voice echoed across the yard. "Morrison! You've got 5 minutes to come out, or we start shooting. That little girl doesn't need to die for your sins." Stone felt the weight of 8 years of guilt and regret pressing down on him like a physical burden. He'd found love again in this brave little girl, only to discover that loving her meant confronting the worst thing he'd ever done. Now, Kane offered him a chance at redemption through death, a final payment for Samuel Johnson's blood. But as he looked at Ruby, still clutching her mother's letter and her father's memory, Stone realized that dying might be the easy way out. Living with the consequences of his actions, earning forgiveness through a lifetime of atonement, that would be the real test of whether Jake Morrison could truly become Jeremiah Stone. The Winchester rifle had been Stone's companion for over a decade, its walnut stock worn smooth by countless hours in his hands. He'd used it to hunt game, defend his property, and in his darker days as Jake Morrison, to take lives when talking failed. Now, as he checked the rifle's action one final time, Stone realized it might serve its last purpose tonight, either protecting the child who hated him or ending the guilt that had consumed him for 8 years. Ruby had fled into the night 20 minutes after Kane's ultimatum, slipping out through the kitchen, while Stone and Marcus planned their defense. Sarah discovered her absence when she went to check on the girl, finding only an empty room and an open window that told the story of a child's desperate escape. "She can't have gone far," Marcus said, though his voice carried little conviction. "A little girl on foot in the dark." "She's Samuel Johnson's daughter," Stone interrupted grimly. "She's got her father's courage and her mother's determination. She could be anywhere by now. He shouldered the Winchester and headed for the door. "I'm going after her, boss. That's exactly what Kane wants. You step outside, and you're a dead man." Stone paused at the threshold, looking back at his loyal foreman. "If I don't find her, she'll die out there. Wolves, cold, or worse. An 8-year-old girl alone on the frontier won't last until morning." He met Marcus's concerned gaze. "I killed her father, Marcus. I won't let her die because of my sins." "Then we all go," Marcus said firmly. "The boys have been talking, and they're not about to let Kane and his murderers burn down the ranch. Whatever you did as Jake Morrison, you've been a fair boss and a decent man as Jeremiah Stone." Stone felt a surge of unexpected emotion at his foreman's loyalty. "I don't deserve—" "Deserving's got nothing to do with it," Marcus interrupted. "Right's right, and a gang of bounty hunters terrorizing a little girl ain't right, no matter what her guardian might have done in the past." Outside, Kane's voice echoed across the yard again. "Time's running out, Morrison. Show yourself or we start burning buildings." Stone moved to the window and called back, "The girl's gone, Kane. She ran off when she learned the truth. It's just me you want now. Let my people go, and I'll face you man to man." Kane's laughter carried a cold edge. "You think I'm stupid, Morrison? That girl's your weakness. I saw how you looked at her when I was here before. You'll come out to save her, or you'll watch her burn with the rest." "She's not here," Stone shouted, frustration bleeding into his voice. "Then we'll find her," Kane replied. "Boys, spread out and start looking. A little colored girl can't have gone far in the dark." Stone felt his blood turn to ice as the implications sank in. Kane's men would hunt Ruby through the night, like wolves tracking wounded prey, and she had no way to defend herself against grown men with guns and horses. The thought of those hardened killers finding her alone in the darkness made Stone's vision blur with rage. "How many rounds you got for that Winchester?" Marcus asked, noting the change in his boss's expression. "Enough," Stone replied, checking his cartridge belt. "More than enough." Carlos Mendez appeared from the barn, leading 3 saddled horses and carrying his own rifle. Behind him came 2 more of Stone's hands, young Jimmy Palmer and old Pete Williams, both armed and grim-faced. "Boss," Carlos said in his accented English, "we heard what that man said about hunting the little girl. No man rides for Broken Arrow." "Who would allow such a thing?" Pete Williams spat tobacco juice and nodded his agreement. "Known you for 7 years, Mr. Stone. Don't much care what you done before that, but I seen how you care for that child. Any man wants to hurt her will have to go through us first." Stone felt his throat tighten with emotion. These men knew the truth about his past now. Kane's accusations had made that clear, but they were still willing to stand with him. "I can't ask you to—" "You ain't asking," Jimmy interrupted, his young face set with determination. "We're volunteering. That little girl read stories to my daughter when she was sick last month. She's family to all of us now." Sarah appeared from the kitchen, her face pale but resolute. "I've packed medical supplies and food," she said, handing Stone a canvas bag. "When you find her, and you will find her, she'll need care and comfort." Stone looked around at these people who had become more than employees. They were the closest thing to family he'd had since Margaret's death. The knowledge that they would stand with him, despite learning his darkest secrets, gave him strength he hadn't felt in years. "All right," Stone said, his voice carrying the authority that had built an empire. "Here's how we do this. Carlos, you and Pete circle around to the north pasture. Kane's men will expect us to go out the front way. Jimmy, you stay here with Sarah and defend the house. Marcus and I will take the direct approach and draw their attention while the others search for Ruby." "What if we find her first?" Pete asked. "Get her to town, to Sheriff Daniels. He may not be able to help against Kane's bounty claim, but he won't let a child be harmed." Stone checked his pistol and knife, making sure both were secure. "And if Kane or his men try to stop you, we'll handle it," Carlos said quietly, his dark eyes hard with promise. As the men prepared to leave, Stone found himself thinking about the letter Ruby had discovered, the confession he'd written to Margaret in a moment of drunken remorse 8 years ago. He'd thought that letter was his final word on Samuel Johnson's death, a private admission of guilt that would die with him. Instead, it had become the key that unlocked the truth and shattered the fragile peace he'd found with Ruby. But perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps some sins were too great to be buried beneath good deeds and changed behavior. Perhaps redemption required facing the full consequences of one's actions, no matter how devastating those consequences might be. The Winchester felt heavier in his hands as Stone considered what lay ahead. He might die tonight, probably would die if Kane had his way, but before that happened, he would find Ruby and make sure she was safe. It was the least he could do for Samuel Johnson's daughter, the last gift he could give to the child he'd grown to love like his own. "Boss," Marcus said quietly as they prepared to mount their horses, "whatever happens out there, I want you to know you're a good man. Maybe you weren't always, but you are now. Don't let Kane or anybody else tell you different." Stone gripped his foreman's shoulder in silent thanks, unable to trust his voice to respond. Then they were moving, riding out into the darkness where Kane and his hunters waited. The Winchester rode across Stone's saddle, ready for whatever violence the night would bring. In the distance, a child's scream pierced the night air, high, terrified, and unmistakably Ruby's voice. Stone spurred his horse forward, no longer caring about tactics or survival. The only thing that mattered now was reaching her before Kane's men could do their worst. The rifle bucked against his shoulder as he fired warning shots into the air, letting Kane know he was coming. "I'm here, Kane," he shouted into the darkness. "Leave the girl alone. Your fight's with me." But even as he rode toward an almost certain death, Stone felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years. Peace. Not the false calm he'd built around his guilt, but the genuine peace that came from finally doing the right thing, regardless of the cost. Samuel Johnson's daughter would live, even if her father's killer had to die to ensure it. The Winchester was ready, his resolve was firm, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, a little girl was counting on the man who had destroyed her family to somehow save her life. It was a terrible irony, but Stone embraced it fully. This was his chance for redemption, not through death, but through sacrifice. Not through running from his past, but through facing it with courage and love. The night was far from over, and Kane's trap was still closing around them, but Stone rode forward with the certainty of a man who had finally found his purpose. He would save Ruby Mae Johnson, daughter of Samuel Johnson, or die in the attempt. Either way, Jake Morrison's debt would finally be paid in full. The sheriff's badge caught the moonlight as Sheriff Daniels emerged from behind the old oak tree, his weathered face grim with determination. Stone had never been so relieved to see the lawman's familiar figure, even though he knew Daniels carried legal authority to arrest Jake Morrison on sight. The badge represented justice, something Stone had run from for 8 years, but now found himself desperate to embrace. "Hold it right there, Kane!" Daniels called out, his rifle trained on the bounty hunter. "This has gone far enough." Kane whirled in his saddle, his pale eyes reflecting fury at the interruption. "Sheriff, you're interfering with legal bounty work. Morrison's wanted dead or alive, and I got papers to prove it." "Maybe so," Daniels replied evenly, "but terrorizing children ain't part of any bounty claim I've ever seen. Now where's the girl?" Stone followed the sheriff's gaze and spotted Ruby tied to a tree 30 yards away, her small form almost invisible in the shadows. 2 of Kane's men stood guard over her, their rifles ready but uncertain in the face of the sheriff's intervention. Ruby's eyes found Stone's across the distance, and he saw fear there, but also a stubborn defiance that reminded him painfully of her father. "She's safe enough," Kane said, though his voice carried a defensive edge. "Just insurance to make sure Morrison comes out to face justice instead of hiding behind hired guns. Using a child as bait is kidnapping, Kane. That's a federal crime. And it trumps your bounty papers." Daniels moved closer, his badge glinting with each step. "Let her go, and we'll settle this legal-like." Stone urged his horse forward, the Winchester across his saddle ready, but not yet aimed. "I'm here, Kane. You got what you wanted. Jake Morrison standing in the open. Let Ruby go and we'll finish this." Kane's hand moved to his pistol, but he hesitated as more figures emerged from the darkness. Marcus Webb and Carlos Mendez appeared. On Kane's flanks, their rifles trained on the bounty hunter's men. Behind them came unexpected reinforcements. Townspeople Stone barely knew, led by Dr. Harrison and the banker's wife, Mrs. Crawford. "What's this?" Kane demanded, his confidence faltering as he found himself outnumbered. Mrs. Crawford stepped forward, her Sunday dress incongruous, but her voice steady with moral authority. "This is the decent people of Cedar Falls saying enough is enough. That child has been through more than any little one should bear, and we won't stand by while grown men use her for their revenge." Dr. Harrison nodded his agreement, his medical bag in one hand and an old army revolver in the other. "I delivered that girl's mother when she passed through here 9 years ago. I won't see the daughter terrorized by men who put vengeance above decency." Stone felt his throat tighten with emotion as more townspeople emerged from cover, the blacksmith, the school teacher, even old Mrs. Peterson from the general store. These were people who had shunned him when he'd taken Ruby in, who had criticized his decision and threatened his business. Now they stood with him against Kane's vigilante justice. "You all know what he is," Kane said desperately, gesturing at Stone. "Jake Morrison is a killer and a thief. He murdered my boy in cold blood, and now he's using that innocent child to hide behind his guilt." "Maybe he was those things," Sheriff Daniels said quietly, "but I've watched Jeremiah Stone for 3 years now. Watched him pay fair wages, donate to the church, and take in an orphaned child when nobody else would. Man's past don't define him forever. What matters is who he chooses to be today." Ruby's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "He killed my daddy!" The words carried across the clearing with heartbreaking clarity. "Mr. Stone killed my daddy, and I hate him for it." Silence fell over the gathering as Ruby's accusation hung in the air. Stone felt every eye turn to him, waiting for his response to the child's public condemnation. Kane smiled with cold satisfaction, thinking he'd found his vindication. "She's right," Stone said quietly, his voice carrying in the still night air. "I killed Samuel Johnson in Denver 8 years ago. I was drunk and angry, and everything Kane says I was. I took Ruby's father away before she was even born, and there's no forgiveness great enough to wash away that sin." Kane straightened in his saddle, preparing to claim victory, but Stone wasn't finished. "But that little girl has been my light in the darkness for the past month. She's taught me what love looks like, what sacrifice means, what redemption might be possible for a man like me." Stone's voice grew stronger with each word. "I can't bring back her father, and I can't undo the pain I caused. But I can make sure she grows up safe and loved, and I can face whatever justice she and this community think I deserve." Ruby's tear-filled eyes met his across the distance, and Stone saw something shift in her expression. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but a recognition of truth that ran deeper than anger. Sheriff Daniels stepped forward, his badge catching the light one more time. "That's enough talking. Kane, you and your men are under arrest for kidnapping. Stone, you're coming with me to sort out these warrant issues proper-like. And that little girl is going home where she belongs, safe and sound." The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge, with justice, revenge, and redemption all hanging in the balance. The blood-stained bandana lay crumpled in the dirt where Kane had fallen, a stark reminder of how quickly violence could explode in the space between heartbeats. Stone pressed his own bandana against the bullet wound in his shoulder, feeling the warm spread of blood through the fabric while trying to process what had just happened. Kane's final desperate gambit had come when Sheriff Daniels approached to place him under arrest. The bounty hunter had grabbed his pistol with the wild fury of a man watching 8 years of obsession slip away. But instead of aiming at the sheriff or Stone, he'd turned his weapon toward Ruby, one last act of spite to ensure that if he couldn't, have his revenge. Jake Morrison would still lose everything that mattered. Stone's reaction had been pure instinct, diving from his horse to shield Ruby with his own body just as Kane's gun roared in the night. The bullet meant for the child had torn through Stone's shoulder instead, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in front of the tree where Ruby was tied. But Kane's triumph had lasted only seconds. Sheriff Daniels's rifle had spoken with final authority, and the bounty hunter now lay motionless. His quest for vengeance ended forever. The bandana that had covered his face during the long ride from Denver now soaked up his blood, a fitting end to 8 years of hate. "Mr. Stone!" Ruby's voice was high with panic as she struggled against her bonds. "Mr. Stone, are you hurt bad?" "I'm all right, sweetheart," Stone managed, though his voice was tight with pain. "Just a scratch." He reached up with his good arm to untie the ropes that bound her, his fingers clumsy with shock and blood loss. Dr. Harrison was beside them within moments, his medical bag already open as he began examining Stone's wound. "Hold still," the doctor ordered. "Bullet went clean through, but you're losing blood fast." Ruby's small hands fluttered around Stone's face as tears streamed down her cheeks. "You saved me," she whispered. "You took a bullet meant for me." "Course." "I did," Stone said, managing a weak smile despite the pain. "Told you I'd die before I let anyone hurt you, but I said I hated you. I said—" Ruby's voice broke with the weight of her conflicted emotions. "You said the truth," Stone interrupted gently. "I killed your daddy, Ruby May. That's a fact that won't change no matter what happens between us. But that don't mean I can't love you like my own daughter, and it don't mean I won't protect you with my life." Dr. Harrison worked quickly to stop the bleeding, but his expression remained grave. "We need to get him back to town. He's lost a lot of blood, and there could be infection." Sheriff Daniels approached, his badge no longer just a symbol of law, but of justice finally served. "Kane's dead," he announced quietly. "His men are surrendering. This whole sorry business is over." Ruby looked up at the sheriff with eyes that seemed far too old for her 8 years. "What happens now? To Mr. Stone, I mean?" Daniels knelt beside them, his weathered face gentle as he addressed the child. "Well, young lady, I reckon that's partly up to you. The law says Jake Morrison was a wanted man, but the people here tonight saw Jeremiah Stone risk his life to save yours. Sometimes the law and justice ain't quite the same thing." Mrs. Crawford stepped forward from the circle of townspeople, her earlier righteousness now tempered with something deeper. "Sheriff, that man just took a bullet meant for a child. Whatever he might have done in the past, tonight he proved what kind of man he really is." Dr. Harrison finished bandaging Stone's shoulder and helped him to his feet. "You'll live," he said simply, "but you need rest and care. No more heroics for a while." Ruby slipped her small hand into Stone's uninjured one, her touch soft but determined. "I want to go home," she said quietly. "I want to go home to the Broken Arrow with Mr. Stone." Stone felt tears threaten as he looked down at this brave little girl who had every reason to hate him, but was choosing something else instead. "Ruby, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she said firmly. "Mama always said that forgiving don't mean forgetting, and it don't mean what someone did was right, but it means choosing love over hate, even when hate feels easier." She pulled his blood-stained bandana from his pocket and carefully refolded it, her small fingers gentle with the fabric that had absorbed his sacrifice. "You bled for me tonight, Mr. Stone. You were willing to die to keep me safe. That don't erase what you did to my daddy, but it tells me who you really are now." Sheriff Daniels stood slowly, his decision made. "Far as I'm concerned, Jake Morrison died tonight when that bullet hit. What's left is Jeremiah Stone, a man who's got a little girl to raise and a life to live right." The crowd of townspeople began to disperse, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and newfound respect for the man they'd once shunned. Mrs. Crawford paused to speak to Ruby directly. "Child, you'll always have friends in Cedar Falls. Don't you forget that." As they prepared for the slow journey back to the ranch, Ruby walked beside Stone's horse, her rag doll tucked under one arm and his blood-stained bandana held carefully in her other hand. The fabric would always remind them both of the price of redemption, not just Stone's willingness to sacrifice his life, but Ruby's courage to forgive the unforgivable. "Mr. Stone," Ruby said as they began the walk home. "Yes, sweetheart? I think my daddy would have liked the man you became, and I think my mama knew this would happen someday." She looked up at him with eyes that held both sorrow and hope. "Maybe that's why God brought us together, so we could help each other heal." Stone nodded, not trusting his voice to respond, but reached down to squeeze her shoulder gently. The blood-stained bandana fluttered in her small hands like a banner of hard-won grace, proof that some wounds could heal and some sins could be redeemed through love and sacrifice. The handmade wooden cross stood beside Samuel Johnson's grave, its rough-hewn surface weathered but sturdy, a testament to the patient work of two pairs of hands learning to build something beautiful together. Stone had carved the vertical beam during his recovery, while Ruby had sanded the crosspiece smooth. With the careful attention she brought to everything important, together they had created something neither could have made alone. 6 months had passed since the night Kane died, and Jake Morrison was finally laid to rest. Stone's shoulder had healed completely, though it ached when storms approached, a permanent reminder of the price of redemption. Ruby had grown 2 inches and gained 10 pounds under Sarah's devoted care, her cheeks now round with health instead of hollow with hunger. "Tell me again about the day you met Mama," Ruby said, settling beside Stone on the quilt they'd spread beneath the oak tree that shaded her parents' graves. It had become their Sunday ritual, visiting the cemetery after church, sharing stories that kept Samuel and Mary Johnson alive in memory. Stone smiled, noting how Ruby's request had evolved over the months. At first, she'd wanted to hear about her father's final moments, needing to understand exactly what had happened in that Denver saloon. Gradually, her questions had shifted to happier memories, her mother's childhood, her parents' courtship, the joy they'd found despite their brief time together. "Your mama was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen," Stone began, settling into the familiar rhythm of storytelling. Not just her face, though she was lovely, but the way she carried herself, like she knew secrets about kindness that the rest of us were still learning. Ruby nodded, having heard this story many times, but never tiring of it. She'd pieced together her family's history through these conversations, creating a tapestry of memory that honored both her parents' love and the complex path that had brought her to the Broken Arrow. And Daddy really wasn't afraid when that bad man, when Jake Morrison came into the saloon. Stone chose his words carefully, as he always did when discussing that night. Ruby knew the truth, but still struggled sometimes with the duality of loving the man who'd killed her father. "Your daddy was the bravest man I ever knew. He stood up for what was right, even when it cost him everything. That's the kind of courage I hope you inherited from him. Mama said courage isn't not being scared, it's doing what's right even when you are scared." Ruby plucked a dandelion and began separating its petals with methodical precision. "Were you scared the night Kane came to the ranch?" "Terrified," Stone admitted honestly. "Not of dying, but of failing you. Of letting the man who'd already taken your father take your life too." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching clouds drift across the Montana sky. The simple wooden cross cast its shadow across both graves, a bridge between past and present that somehow made the tragedy bearable. "Mr. Stone," Ruby's voice was tentative, the way it got when she was working up courage to say something important. "What is it, sweetheart? I've been thinking about what to call you." She kept her eyes on the dandelion in her hands, not looking at him. "Sarah says some children call their guardians different things, depending on how they feel." Stone felt his heart skip a beat. They'd never discussed the formal arrangements that had been made after Kane's death, how Sheriff Daniels had quietly made the wanted posters disappear, how the territorial judge had granted Stone legal guardianship, how the community had embraced them both with surprising warmth. "What kind of different things?" he asked gently. Well, I could keep calling you Mr. Stone, which feels respectful, but maybe a little distant. Ruby began braiding the dandelion stem with unconscious skill. Or I could call you Jeremiah, which Mrs. Crawford says some children do when they want to feel grown up. Stone waited, sensing there was more. Or, Ruby's voice became even smaller, I could call you Papa, not because you're replacing my real daddy, but because you've been taking care of me like a papa would. The word hit Stone with unexpected force. Papa. Such a simple word, but it carried the weight of acceptance, forgiveness, and love that he'd never thought possible. Ruby, I would be honored if you called me Papa. Your daddy will always be your father, the man who gave you life and would have loved you fiercely. But if you'll have me, I'd like to be your Papa, the man who gets to watch you grow up. Ruby finally looked up at him, her dark eyes bright with tears and hope. Really, you wouldn't mind, even though people might think it's strange? People have thought stranger things about us, Stone said with a gentle laugh. Besides, families aren't always built the traditional way. Sometimes God puts people together who need each other, even when the circumstances are complicated. Ruby nodded and carefully placed the braided dandelion at the base of her parents' cross. Mama, Daddy, she whispered, this is Papa. I think you'd like him now. As they walked back toward the buggy, Ruby slipped her hand into Stone's with the natural ease of a child who felt completely safe. The gesture still amazed him. This daily miracle of unconditional trust from someone who had every reason to fear him. Papa, Ruby said as they drove through the gates of the Broken Arrow. Yes, sweetheart. Do you think we'll be happy? Really happy, I mean, not just pretending. Stone considered the question seriously, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The ranch was more prosperous than ever. His reputation for integrity had actually attracted new business partners who respected a man willing to sacrifice for his principles. Sarah hummed while she worked, clearly pleased to have a child in the house again. Marcus and the other hands had become protective uncles to Ruby, teaching her to ride and rope with patient dedication. But more than the external success, Stone felt a peace he'd never experienced before. The guilt that had driven him for 8 years wasn't gone, would never be completely gone, but it had been transformed into something purposeful. Every day with Ruby was a chance to honor Samuel Johnson's memory by loving his daughter well. I think we're going to be happy, Stone said finally. Not the kind of happiness that pretends bad things never happened, but the deeper kind that comes from choosing to build something beautiful on the foundation of hard-learned wisdom. Ruby nodded solemnly, then brightened as she spotted Sarah, waving from the porch. Look, Papa, Sarah made cookies. As they approached the house that had become a true home, Stone marveled at the journey that had brought them here. He'd found Ruby in a graveyard, both of them lost and grieving. Now they were found, not just by each other, but by the community that had learned to see beyond past mistakes to present grace. The handmade cross they'd left at the cemetery would weather many storms, but it would endure, a symbol of love. Strong enough to bridge the gap between sin and redemption, between loss and healing, between a broken past and a hopeful future. Like the bond between a little girl and the man who'd become her papa, it was built to last, through whatever trials might come. Sometimes the deepest wounds really did come from the smallest voices, but sometimes those same small voices could speak the words that heal what seemed forever broken. In the end, Stone thought as Ruby ran ahead to claim her cookies, that might be the greatest miracle of all.